Okay guys, let's get started with today's topic. Today's topic is file and print servers. So obviously the last couple of lessons, we've installed Active Directory, we've learned how to create users and hopefully some groups. And today we're going to solidify this a little bit more by creating those groups according to our AGDLP methodology and then giving them secure access to files and printers. Okay, so today we're talking about all about file and print servers. So obviously that's part of any network. Any network, people who work on a network will need to access some files that they need to share with someone else. And obviously these days with printers, instead of actually having a printer on every computer, we need to have a printer that everyone can print to, and that's the sharing of printers. So we'll have a look at how that's done with Server 2016. So today our objective is to explore file servers and understand print servers. So first of all, let's talk about sharing in general. Okay, in Microsoft, sharing is making a resource which is on your local computer available to the network. That's just a term. Okay, sharing, making a resource that's on your local machine available to the network. Sharing has been around for ages. Okay, since networking was ever invented, and Microsoft was an operating system. Okay, basically, so it's a little bit of a leftover from those days where we had only FAT32 or FAT16 file systems. Okay, so these days what file system do we use on Microsoft? NTFS. Okay, we'll talk about NTFS a little bit later. But in those days when we used FAT as our file system, there was no such thing as file system permissions. Okay, that's one of the first things I want to get you to try to remember. On the FAT file system, there's no such thing as file system permissions. On the NTFS file system, which is what we're using these days for Microsoft operating systems and drives, we do have file system permissions. So yeah, I said that sharing was around for ages. Sharing was around when we used the FAT file system. Okay, so as a result, we have these things called shared permissions. So when we actually make a resource which is available to the network, we are sharing it. But shared permissions determine or control who and what type of access a user or group has to that shared folder from the network. Okay, that's underlined and bold in the PowerPoint. The key thing is from the network. Those shared permissions, only if my computer was sharing a resource, it only affects the people who are coming across the network and accessing that resource I'm sharing. Okay, these shared permissions. If I was actually sitting at this computer and I was actually seeing the same resources which is being shared, but because I'm not going through a network, I'm going through the local file system, those shared permissions will have nothing to control me. They can't control me, okay? They have no, they don't apply to me at all, okay? So that's the first thing I want you to remember, or that shared permissions is only from over the network. What are some of these shared permissions? Obviously, like these are pretty basic. These are read. Basically, what does that mean? That means that someone can actually read the files, copy the files, and execute the files if they're executable files. Okay, they can see the files obviously, and then there's change. Change basically gives you everything that the read does, plus the ability to actually modify the files. Okay, create new files, as well as delete the files or folders. Okay, fairly straightforward. And then there's full control. You probably go, hey, if change pretty much lets us do everything, doesn't it? So what does full control do? Full control actually goes a little bit further. So it gives you everything that change does, but the key thing between full control and change is that they actually let you manage the permissions as well. Okay, what does that mean? That means if I have full control and Dajun over here doesn't have any access, I can, because I've got full control, I can then give Dajun here read access. You see how that works? If I've got full control, I can then change the shared permissions. So shared permissions is there for controlling access to the shared resources from over the network. but then there's also NTFS permissions. Okay, we said that the file system that we use on Windows these days is NTFS. Okay, it stands for New Technology File System. And we can, with NTFS, we can set what's called file system permissions. Okay, so if you look at this, the NTFS permissions is used to control who and what type of access a user or group has to a shared resource or folder from across the network as well as locally. Remember how I described before that if I had shared permissions only, it only affected the people coming across from the network? And if I was sitting on the computer locally, it wouldn't affect me at all. So even though I've got read access from over the network, shared permission, when I log into the computer which has the files on there, I could do anything I like. So it really doesn't control your access from all aspects. Okay, whereas NTFS does. Okay, so NTFS controls your access from over the network as well as if you're logged in locally. Okay, key difference between the two. NTFS has what's called, because it's for the whole file system, it has what's called explicit and inherited permissions. Okay, what does that mean? When I say explicit, it means this is the resource. Okay, if this is the resource that I'm holding in my hand and now I want to give you read permission, I will put your group or your user account as a trustee of this resource and give you read access. That means you explicitly have read access to this resource. Okay, so that's what explicit permission is, where you are given access directly to that resource. Okay, but if you know that in the file system there's lots of layers of folders and stuff, isn't there? So subfolders and so forth. Okay, if we only had explicit permissions, it would mean that we would have to go to every file, every folder, and give people the same permissions over and over again. That's a lot of waste of time, isn't it? So what we also have is what's called inherited permissions, which means that if I explicitly assign a permission to a higher level folder, those permissions flow all the way down, same permissions. Okay, so which means that instead of actually giving every file and every folder the same permissions over and over again, with explicit permissions, I can just do it once in the area of the file system and expect those permissions to flow down to every file, every folder that's underneath that area. Okay, and that's called inherited permissions. Okay, it's inherited from the folder above. So with this NTFS permissions, it can get a little bit complicated, but we've got some basic standard permissions, and they're fairly easy to understand. Like we've got read. Okay, what does read do? It allows people to see the files, allows people to open the files, allows people to execute the file. Not execute the files. Allows people to read the files and read the contents of the files. We have write, which allows someone with all of the read permissions and as well as the execute permissions, but also let someone modify the files and create new files or folders. But if you notice, it doesn't say delete, does it? So if you've got write, you can't actually delete what's there. You can create new things, but you can't delete what's there. There's read and execute, which is one level above read, basically, which allows you all the read permissions plus the ability to execute files which are executable, like exes, bats, and .coms. Probably the minimum permission is list folder contents. Okay, that's basically just seeing the files are there. Okay, you can't open the files, you can just see the files that's in the directory. Okay, you can view the contents of the folder but not read the contents of the actual files. Modify is probably the second highest permission here. Modify allows you to read, write, execute, and delete files and folders. So basically everything that you can do will read, write, execute, list folder contents, but plus the ability to delete. Okay, so that's pretty much the highest permission as far as the file and folders is concerned, except for this full control. Again, what is full control? Full control is everything you can do with modify, because that's pretty much all you can do with the files and stuff. But full control allows you to manage the permissions on that file folder. Okay. It also allows you to take what's called take ownership. So basically, when a file is created, the owner of that file is the person who creates it by default. Okay. So that counts towards your quota and all that kind of stuff if you're doing quotas. But when if someone leaves the organization, and the user accounts are cancelled or deleted or disabled, um, what you can do is actually take ownership of this file for anyone who's got full control. Okay, so full control allows you to take ownership as well as manage the permissions. So again, if I've got full control, I can then say these other users can have a level of permissions. So here's an example of assigning permissions in the file system. You can see that there's actually just these permissions here. And this is an example of how you would assign it. And obviously in your worksheet, we'll walk you through doing this a lot more. But besides those basic permissions, there's a whole heap of more advanced permissions. And what you would do is you would click on this link that says show advanced permissions, and then it'll bring you up with all the other advanced permissions. And to be honest, for our subject, you don't need to know them. Okay? For most people, 90% of the time, these basic permissions is enough to do what they need to do. Okay? But if you want to look at the advanced permissions, there's a whole heap here. Okay, we're not going to go through every one of these, but you can look at this PowerPoint and have a read for yourself. But obviously, we've got finer grain of control. Like, for example, traverse folder, execute file. And if you look at the description, traverse folder permissions allows or denies security principals the ability to move through this folder that they don't have permissions to access. So they can reach the files and folders they do have permissions to access at a lower level. Okay, so what does that mean? That means they can browse through these folders to find the file that they have permission to, because if they didn't have permission to these folders above here, they might never be able to get to that file. Okay, so that's going to be in some really unique situations where you need to use these kind of advanced permissions. So just be aware of them, but obviously for our subject here, most of the time, all the time for this subject, in fact, those basic permissions is enough. And for the real life work environment, 90% of the time, those basic permissions is enough. Okay. So there's two ways of assigning permissions, guys. There's allowing and denying permissions. Okay. So for example, the easiest way is probably to think of to do allow. Okay. Because if you don't allow someone permissions, they usually do not have any permissions to that area of the file system. Okay. But if you there's two approaches. You can open everything up and then deny people permissions in areas that they shouldn't have access to, or you close everything off and then you give permissions to the areas they should have access to. Okay, it's a bit of a blacklist or whitelist approach. Okay, blacklist means everything's allowed except for these things. Okay, that's the denying permission approach. Whereas the whitelist approach is that everything's off limits except for these ones where you are given permission to. Okay, that's the allow permissions. So there are two types of ACEs: access control, allow and deny. There's additive. So basically, you start with no permissions to anything, and then allow permissions to individual security principals that provide them with access that they need. Okay. There's also a subtractive, which is the deny. So you start by granting access to everything to individual security principals, then provide them with full control over the system and elements, and then you start denying them permissions to the things that they need. Okay, but when you're using, I don't like using denies. Okay, basically, unless you give it to them, they don't have permissions anyway. So especially in this early stage when you guys are just learning about it, I would recommend that you only use allows instead of denies, because first of all, if you deny permission, the deny permission overrides any allow permission. So it doesn't matter what you got, you allow full control, but you deny permission, that trumps it, basically, okay? So when you have denies, you just complicate a system. to make it hard to understand for yourself. So at this early stage, I will recommend that you use allow only, and then if you actually really need it, use deny where applicable. Okay, if it's a really top secret area and you don't want people to have access, then you may want to use deny at that point, not everywhere, not as a general first point. So if we look at this diagram, remember we talked about inheritance? So basically, if we didn't have inheritance and we want to give this person, E. Evans, read-write permissions to these folders, we would have to do it here, 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 and here. A lot of work. But with inheritance, we just have to do it at the highest level that he needs access to. And because of inheritance, those permissions will flow down, 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 all the way to wherever the file system stops, okay? So you got to remember that it doesn't flow sideways, it doesn't flow upwards, it doesn't flow any other way except for down, okay? It's just a bit like inheritance in your family. You know, your brother doesn't have brown hair because you've got brown hair. Your brother has brown hair probably because your parents have brown hair, okay? So with where NTFS permissions are assigned at a higher level, it flows down. It allows administrator to easily assign permissions to a whole area of the file system rather than doing it one at a time for every resource. But what if we don't want inheritance? Okay, so let's go back to that picture. What if I say, hey, I've given read-write up here and it's all flowing down, but for this database, I really don't want E. Evans to have read-write. But it's flowing down, isn't it? It's right there. I have to keep it there. That's where I want it. But I don't want E. Evans to have read-write to that folder here. If that's the case, what we can do is actually remove inheritance. Okay, there are two options for removing inheritance. So I'll show you how to remove inheritance in a minute. But there's two ways, two choices. When you remove it, you can actually remove all NTFS permissions, which basically gives you nothing in the list. Okay, you start off with a clean state. But that's a little bit tricky because if you don't add back in the things that should be there, you potentially could lock yourself out, lock the administrator out. Okay, potentially. So what I like to do is I like to convert. Okay, I like to convert wherever it's been inherited as explicit permissions. Once they're explicit permissions, then I can actually remove the ones I don't want, keep the ones I do want. All right, let me just quickly show you some of this, okay, guys? So we've been talking about sharing, we've been talking about NTFS permissions, but we haven't actually seen it in practice. So okay, so someone's been using my virtual machine here. All right. So bear with me, guys. So I'm going to start up this virtual machine again. So while that's starting up, so let's keep on going anyway. All right, so understanding effective access. Okay, so effective access is what permissions or what can you do overall. Let's say you're a user, and because you're a member of you're a student, right? Because you're a student, you get read access to the L drive, let's say. Okay, but maybe we've employed you as a tutor as well. So besides being a student, you're also a tutor. Maybe for the tutor, they can have write access to the L drive as well. So if they've got read access as being a member of a student and they've got write access as being a member of the tutors group, what overall access do they actually have? Which one did I get? Okay, so the understanding effective access is basically understanding how does permissions combine. Okay, so the combination of allow permissions and deny permissions that a security principal gets, whether explicit permissions inherited or received through a group membership, that is called the effective permission. So how does this person, what permissions does he get overall after he gets it from all these sources? Okay, so permissions combine to form effective access. These rules are as follows. When you have allow permissions, okay, allow NTFS permissions, they just combine. They're cumulative. What does that mean? That means that when my friend here is a list student, he gets read permissions to L drive. He's a tutor, he gets write permissions to L drive. What does he get? They just combine and give him read write. Okay? So he gets both read and write, okay? But when you combine deny permissions and allow permissions, the deny permission overrides any allow permissions. And also explicit permissions takes precedence over inherited permissions. So for example, if your group was getting read access to this folder because this folder is in the file system that's below where they've assigned permissions, because it's inherited those permissions. But at this level, you get different permissions. But because you get different permissions directly to this level, that's called explicit. So they override any inherited permissions. All right, so let me just show you all of this. Okay, so let's do that demonstration I was talking about. All right. Okay, so let's actually. This is one of the I've reverted this virtual machine to a snapshot where there's already some users and groups created for us. So let me just show you what the users and groups are. So hopefully you already know how to create users and groups, but obviously in today's worksheet you'll go through that again. But with this particular snapshot I'm using here, there's already users and groups created. So there's already, let's go here. So it's for AWS subject, okay? So it's the typical scenario. You have students and you have lecturers, okay? So for the staff, in this case lecturers, you got A Peters and Oscar Evans, and they're in a group called GG, or global group called GG lecturers. There's, for the student OU, there's a Evans Erfel Evans and a Greg Bieger, and they're in a group called GG, global group called GG students. And for this scenario, there's already a folder here created. It's called student files. Okay, it's called student files on the C drive. And obviously, in this case, we'll talk about the AGDLP later on, but basically students need read access. So the student global group is member of this domain local group called student files read. Okay, the lecturers need modify access. So their global group, the GG lecturers, is a member of this DL student files modify. Okay, so let me just actually, let's create another folder. Okay, so we'll use those same users and groups, and we'll do another folder, and we'll call this VMs. Okay, virtual machines. Okay, so we use virtual machines in class all the time. Again, this is a folder which is sharing virtual machines to all the students, something you guys can easily understand. Okay, so first of all, if I want to make this folder available to the network, we have to do what's called sharing. Okay, so if I go to sharing tab, it's not shared at the moment, but I want to share it. I don't want to just do the basic sharing, I want to do advanced sharing. So I'll share this folder by ticking this box, and the share name is called VMs. Okay. Then I want to assign permissions. So what I recommend we do in class is that, because when we combine share permissions and NTFS permissions, right? What happens is the most restrictive permissions wins. So if we give full control sharing permissions and read-only NTFS permissions, they effectively have read-only because that's more restrictive. So what I like to say that for us, when we're starting off, we're going to give full control to everyone. Okay, that's full control to everyone, because what does that mean? That means we're taking the share permissions out of the picture, and effectively anything we assign with the NTFS permissions now is going to be more restrictive, right? So that becomes the effective access. So we're sort of taking the idea of the share permissions out of the way by giving full control to everyone. Everyone means everyone. Okay. So you're probably going, whoa, that's a bit weird, but basically we're just ignoring the share permissions effectively. So now, how do we assign NTFS permissions? We go to the security tab, and here are some default permissions. Okay, we've got creator owner, person who created this folder. In this case, it was administrator. It's the operating system. Okay, the administrators group, in this case, the domain administrators group, have full control, obviously, by default. And then there's users, which represents anyone who's has an account in Active Directory, and they have read permissions by default. You can see that they're grayed out, isn't it? So if I try to edit this, I can't actually untick these things because they're what's called inherited permissions. Remember we spoke about that? So before, if we don't want these permissions here, what we have to do is, what we said is we have to remove the inheritance. So in order to remove the inheritance, we go to the advanced and we click disabled inheritance. Okay? And when we actually disable an inheritance, we get two choices. Like I said in the PowerPoint just then, we can actually remove all inherited permissions, which means you start off with a clean slate. It means you have nothing. And potentially you could lock yourself out. Or you can convert the inherited permissions into explicit permissions, and that's what I recommend. We'll do that. And we'll click OK to that. And now, instead of being inherited permissions, you can see that if I go edit now, and we go to users, now they're not inherited. Now I can change them if I want to. In fact, I'm going to remove all users because I don't want to give everyone access. I want to give only specific people, groups of people access. So I'm going to click OK to that. And I'm going to now add. So if you remember, we have a, sorry, I should go back to my Active Directory now. So now we're going to create a group. We're going to call it DL VMs read access. This is the domain local group. That's what the DL stands for. And I'm going to create another group called DL VMs modify access. Okay. And basically, students have read access, don't they, to the virtual machines. So I'm going to make sure that the members of this group is the GG students, the globe group, which is the students. Okay, I'll click OK to that. And who needs modify access, guys? The instructors or the lecturers. So basically, I'll go to membership, and I'll add the GG lecturers. Okay. So basically, we'll talk about the AGDLP a little bit later. But with the AGDLP, we've got the global groups, which are members of domain local groups, and users are members of the global groups. And then when we give permissions to the domain local group, they flow back to the global group, which then flows back to the user. Okay. So here's the VMs again. I'll open up the properties. I'll go to security. And sorry, I've done the wrong thing. I'll go to VMs instead of the whole C drive. And you remember I removed the users. It's still there. It's still gone. So I'll click edit now. Now I'll add the DL read, the VMs read and VMs modify, which is for the VMs folder here. Okay. So I'll click OK to that. And obviously for the VMs read, by default you get read and execute list folder contents and read. And that's exactly what I want to give to someone with read. Okay. Okay. When I say read, I really mean list contents, execute, and so forth. For the modify, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click modify, and that basically gives you everything below modify. Okay. So now, because this is shared, if I log in as a student user, I should be able to see the files. Okay. I'll create a new file. Here it is, a bitmap, but I wouldn't be able to change it. If I logged in as a lecturer, I should be able to see the files, as well as delete the files, as well as create new files, as well as change that file. You get me, guys? And if we actually want to check what their effective access is, we can go to the security, go to advanced, and if you look at this effective access tab, I can select a specific user to test, and this time we're going to go we're going to go the student, so Erful Evans. If you remember, this Erful Evans is a student, and if I look at the view the effective access, you can see that this student can traverse. So this shows me all the advanced files as well. Can traverse, can list, can read extended attributes, can have read permissions, but everything else is crossed. Okay, so this is a nice little tool that actually lets us see what effective access a user might have to this folder. If we're not sure, let's select another user. In this time, it's Alan Peters. And if we look at Alan Peters, okay, so view effective access, Alan Peters has a lot more because he's a lecturer and he's got that modified permission. All right, let's get back to our PowerPoint. So understanding ownership. Every file and folder on the NTFS file system has an owner. Like I said, by default, it's whoever creates that file or folder. The owner always can modify the permissions of the file and folder, even if the owner has no permissions themselves. So you actually get a little bit of, you get permissions as the owner, even if you don't have any NTFS permissions. By default, the owner of the file folder is the user account that created it. Any account can take ownership of the file folder if they have permissions to do so. And obviously they need full control to take ownership. Okay. The administrator can take ownership of the file folder. After the administrator takes ownership of the file folder, he or she cannot assign the ownership back to the previous owner. Okay. Once they've taken ownership, it's theirs until someone else takes ownership. Okay. This prevents the administrator's account from accessing a user's files undetected. So if I was an administrator, I might be locked out from someone's personal files. Because I've got full control to the file system, I could take ownership and get access. But once I do that, yeah, I can't give it back. So now the person knows that I've actually gotten access. Okay. So just because you're an administrator and you can, doesn't mean you should. That's what it's protecting against. Okay. Another purpose for files and folder ownership is to calculate your quotas. Like I said, if you implement quotas on your file system, then every file that you own counts towards your quota. So what about when we have shared permissions and NTFS permissions? Like I mentioned just before in the demonstration, when you actually combine shared permissions and NTFS permissions, it's the most restrictive one that wins. So if you have read permissions for share and full control for NTFS, and you're coming from a network, then you only get read permissions because that's the most restrictive one. Okay. When you combine multiple NTFS permissions, they just basically combine. Okay. If they're just using allows, I'm assuming you're just using allow, they just combine. If you're getting read from one source, you're getting write from another source, you have read write. So yeah, so the most lenient permission combines. Okay, but if you use the deny permission, then that is where you could have some problems. Okay, deny always trumps or overrides the allow permissions. So let's talk about the AGDLP, guys. This is very important. So pay attention, guys. Very important, because every time we do the AGDLP, we sort of miss some people, and when they do the assignment or the test, they don't implement it correctly. At its simplest term, AGDLP is where you have accounts are members of global groups. The global groups are members of the domain local group. We then give permissions to the domain local group to the resource, which could be the shared folder. And because we give it to the domain local group, the permission flow back to the members, which are the global groups, which then flow back to its members, which are the user accounts. That's just a methodology. To be honest, this is just Microsoft's best practice, the AGDLP. Okay, it's not necessarily how everyone does it. In fact, for a simple situation, some people just directly give permissions to users. But there's always many ways of doing things, but which is the best way? Which is the most scalable way? Which is the best way for a situation. Okay, so Microsoft preaches this best practice as the AGDLP. So what we usually do is that because you're probably thinking, why do we have 2 levels of group? This sounds like overkill. Okay, if you remember back to when we were discussing groups last lesson, that members of the domain local group can come from any domain in the forest, couldn't they? Okay, so if that's the case, that means what if we had a folder? Okay, let's say that TFSA, we here at tfsa.edu.au, we have a folder that's called the L drive or the student drive, okay, student folder. And that folder has resources for teaching our subjects, and we want to make this available to everyone, every student that's part of our domain, first of all, as well as students that might be coming from our companies that we are partners with. Okay, so maybe they're part of the forest. Maybe we have maybe there's a relationship between all the TAFEs of all the estates. Okay, so if that's the case, I could just set up a domain local student folder access, and then take the global groups which are from the TAFE domain, from let's say Queensland TAFE domain, from Victoria TAFE domain, from Western Australia TAFE domain, all the student groups, global groups, and we put them into the domain local group, all members of this domain local group. Now, when I give read access to this domain local group to that student files folder, those permissions will flow back to every global group that might be coming from all the other domains and to their user accounts. So you see how in a very complicated system where you have multiple domains, that having this AGDLP methodology gives you that ease of administration. Okay, if you just had one server and one domain and a couple of users, that doesn't seem to make sense too much. But for us, we're going to always implement the AGDLP methodology, whether that be in the worksheets, in the assignment, or in the practical test. Okay, guys? So just remember that. So if you don't implement the AGDLP methodology, you will not get the marks for any of those assessments. Okay? So hopefully you were paying attention there. But in the worksheets, you'll get another chance to practice that. There's also auditing files and folders. Okay, so what is auditing? So in security, there's the 3 A's. Authentication, proving who you are. Okay, usually with a username password. That's how you guys logged in. Okay, that's the first A. Second A is authorization. So giving people permissions to do things. Okay, we just spoke about that. Giving people permissions to the file system is a form of authorization. Then the third A is auditing or accounting. What does that mean? Just because you can do something doesn't mean we shouldn't track that you've done that something. Okay, let's say we all have access, or we all have modifier access to a file on a server. Let's say that, hey, I was sacked because I was, not the best employee. So just before I leave, I just go in and I delete everything on the network drive. Well, if I did it, how could anyone prove that I did it? Okay, you can't prove I did it. Someone else did it. You sacked me. I didn't do it. You can't. There's no proof, is there? If there's no such thing as auditing. With auditing, besides actually with authorization, I have the ability to do that because I've got modify. But with auditing, even though I've got the ability to do that, if I've set up auditing on this special important folder, then it will track that I've done that. So therefore, if I actually did delete all the files because I was sacked, now the system administrator or network administrator can say, hey, according to our audit files, you deleted it. Okay, then that can be used as in a court of evidence for in all sorts of actions after that. Okay, so without auditing, you cannot prove that guy did it. With auditing, you can. Yeah, so I'll give you another famous case that might have been in the news recently. So you guys, any of you guys sort of follow footy in this state? You know that a couple of years ago that the Crows coach got murdered by his son, right? So obviously his son was, under psychological care and obviously assessed for whether he was, insane at the time. So basically, obviously, it was a famous case around the state, and all these people were interested and gossipy and stuff like that. And obviously, like for us, the regular citizens, we can't access the medical records of this guy to see, what the deal is, right? But you know that there's a lot of people working in the medical field, and they've got this connected system where doctors can access patient files from all across the state. And what happened was a couple of people did access his patient files to, obviously, because they're snoopy, they're nosy, and they want to get some, information that's not released to the public. So you know what? They did access it. And that's wrong, because unless they are using that information as part of their job, they shouldn't be accessing that information. That's the law of privacy in our country here. The Information Technology Privacy, as well as the Privacy Act and all those kind of things. So just because they could access it, because they're doctors or they're medical professionals, they shouldn't have, but they did. And you know what? They were busted for doing that because someone was auditing the system. Okay, keeping track of who's been accessing it, and they discovered these people who had no connection to actual treatment of this person accessed it, and a lot of people got in trouble for that. Okay, so that was in the news just a couple of years ago for something like this. Okay, and how do we know that people have accessed it? It's through auditing. Okay, no, because it's unethical to do that. Do you understand that in that situation? Yeah, people who go into the folder, you could audit. Okay, people who open the file, you could audit. Absolutely. No, but obviously, if you keep it off grid, that means the people who need to access it can't access it now. Yeah, then what if someone loses the USB stick? Okay, that's happened before. What if someone steals your laptop? All that's happened before. So you have to have a way of actually sharing the information, but the key thing is securely. Okay, with a combination of the three A's: authentication, authorization, and auditing. You protect yourself, or you do. There's never a foolproof way of defeating every process, but with these things all adding together, it just closes the holes in the net a lot more. Okay. So Windows Server supports auditing files and folders, so the administrators can see who is accessing data and who's attempted to access data. So we audit success as well as failures. Auditing is very important for part of security, and Windows Server supports auditing of successful and failed folder and file access attempts. Before you can audit a file or folder, you must enable auditing on that server first. Okay, and in the next level, when you do the 4 AWS subject, we will talk about auditing and do auditing in a little bit more detail. So here's an example of auditing. It's just another tab, and you can actually select what you audit for. Okay, so let me just quickly switch over to our file server again. So if we go to security, go to advanced, and then we have auditing, and then we can add which group of people we want to audit. It could be everyone, it could be some administrators, it could be doctors. Okay, and then we can actually, once we've actually, let's say we'll audit lecturers, because lecturers, they might be changing grades. Okay, what do we want to audit? Yeah, all these things. Read, traverse the folder. Okay, traverse the folder is going into the folder. So if this is a super sensitive folder and people shouldn't be going down unless they need to do something, then we can log or audit or account for who's going in or not. Okay, so I'll just leave that there. We'll go back to our PowerPoint. Okay, let's talk about printing. Okay, so one of the necessary basic things we need for any network is printing. Okay, so obviously we could have a printer for every computer that's in the network. Like in this room, there's 20 computers. We could have 20 printers. You know what? That's a waste of money, isn't it? Each printer is probably the cheaper nasty ones you probably get for, what's it, $50, $60 maybe even cheaper. But you know how they are. They run out of ink really quickly. And it's probably costs just as much to get new ink cartridges as it is for that cheap and nasty printer. They probably lack a lot of functionality and lacked the quality printouts. Okay, so for 20 computers at $50 each, that's $1,000, isn't it? Okay, that's $1,000 just for printers for this room. That seems like a waste of money. Maybe if we actually put $500 towards a really nice printer with some functionality like double-sided printing and so forth, we can actually put it on a network like that one there and share it to everyone. Okay, I'm sure every one of you guys, even at home, should have a printer that's connected to your network. Who's got that? Who's got a printer who's connected to the network at home? All of you guys. Yeah, pretty much. You can buy a pretty basic printer, but usually it has some sort of Wi-Fi access and you can print from the network. So it's very common now. So, but how do you control who has access to these printers and what type of access? Okay, so Windows servers can act like a print server. Okay, what does that mean? A print server is basically the server that makes this printer available to the network. The print server is where the print jobs get queued. So if we all click print, a queue is a lineup. So it all gets sent through the network, sent to the server, and it's a lineup of your print jobs. Okay, and then the printer can be connected to the server via FireWire, serial, parallel, USB, or TCP/IP port. When a printer is shared by a Windows server, it is able to manage its print queue. What does that mean? That means if I'm the administrator or if I'm someone with that permission, I can go into the print queue. Remember the lineup of print jobs? There's 20 of us. We all printed. But I know that Dajung's print job is actually super important because he needs to get it out for this client ASAP. So as an administrator, I could just move his job from the bottom of the queue to the top of the queue. I can see that, hey, what's your name again? Lachlan. It's printed a 500-page print job on this printer that shouldn't be used for that kind of jobs. I could go, hey, that print job shouldn't be here. I'll delete it. Okay. So what the print queue stores the print jobs until they can be printed. And what we can do by assigning permissions is that someone could change the print job's priority. So for example, if this is a physical printer, we call it a print device, but the manager uses it and regular staff uses it. We could give the manager a high priority and the regular users low priority. So therefore, if two jobs come in at the same time, the manager gets his job printed first. We can also pause a print job. We can resume a print job. We can restart a print job. We can cancel a print job. And we can actually move the print job up and down the queue. It's also important to provide appropriate drivers for the printer. So because we've got the server, but we could have all sorts of different clients on the network. We could have a Windows XP computer. We could have some Windows 7, some Windows 8, some Windows 10. The print driver, we all know what a driver is. It's a software that actually makes the hardware work properly. So in order for them to print correctly, they need to have the correct driver. So if we actually install the printer on the server, we can actually put the right drivers on the server so that when these other computers print to it, they download the right drivers automatically. Let's talk about the idea of printers and print devices. Okay, printers and print devices. So basically the print device is the physical printer, the printer you can actually touch, okay? Whereas the printers in our talk here is the actual icon that represents that physical print device, okay? So basically the printers are the print queue to the print device are the physical printers themselves, and we can create multiple printers to the same print device. Whoa, why would we do that? We could do that because of priorities, okay? So for example, for that one printer that's in office, we could have a print device in the one print device in office. We could have a manager printer and a staff printer, all pointing to that same print device. We'll set the manager printer to a higher priority than the staff printer, and then if manager prints and a regular staff prints and they come in at the same time, the manager gets priority. Okay. We can also create multiple print devices that connects to the same printer. Okay, what does that mean? That means that, hey, instead of actually all our users selecting which printer they print to, because there's four physical print devices in Office, how about we just give them one printer, and when they click print, they just click print. And then when it gets to the server will find whichever of the four printers devices is free and sends it out of that one. So that's called printer pooling. So if we've got a busy printing situation, we can have multiple physical print devices connected to the same printer, and then the jobs will be just load balance between them, whichever one's free. Some other benefits is that you get your print jobs really fast printed out. You don't have to wait for the 20 print jobs that's ahead of you. Those 20 print jobs might be spread across 4 devices, let's say. Okay. Also redundancy. What if one of the printers has got a paper jam? What if one of the printers has got is out of ink? What if another one is like broken down? Well, if they're all broken down, you have 4. You still have one that can actually still print the job, can't you? So therefore, it will still keep on working, even if you have some physical print devices who are down. What is enhanced point and print? So enhanced point and print uses the V4 driver model to provide a simplified management structure for network print drivers. Benefits of this point and print include that print servers do not need to store any client print drivers. Drivers are isolated, preventing file naming conflicts. A single driver can support multiple devices, and driver packages are smaller and faster to install, and the print drivers and the printer user interface can be deployed independently. So let's talk about printer pools. Okay, the printer pool is a collection of physical print devices that appear as one logical printer on the network. The user installs a local printer, a single local printer, but the multiple print devices are available on the server for processing the print jobs. The entire printer pool uses a centralized print queue for the job management, so they all appear in the same queue, but they come out of many physical print devices. So like I said, printer pools provide several advantages, include they can complete your print jobs faster because there's more of them doing the job. If a single print device fails, the other print device can still provide printing services. If printing requests are load balanced across the print devices in the pool, so therefore you don't have one printer which is overused and other printers which is underused. They're load balanced, okay, which means the load is shared. We also have what's called printer permissions now. Okay, so just because there's a printer that's a resource, we can also control who has access and what kind of access. Okay, obviously the basic permission is print. Am I allowed to print to that printer? Okay, if it's that super duper, like a laser printer that prints on bottles and fabrics and this and that, maybe we shouldn't give everyone print access. Maybe we only give print access to a specific group of people who needs to do that, because otherwise you could have people accidentally using that printer to print silly things. Okay. Manage documents, that's interesting. But by default, when you send a print job to the printer, you can manage your own documents. You can delete it, you can cancel it, you can pause it, okay, in the print queue. But you cannot manage anyone else's. You cannot see anyone else's document. But if you have managed document, what happens is that you can see everyone's print jobs, and now you can do that reordering of the print jobs, stopping, starting print jobs, okay? And managed printer. Managed printer gives you everything that is included in print and managed documents, but it also allows you to manage the permissions, change the permissions, turn off the sharing, change the properties, and delete the share. And there's obviously a list of more detailed specialized permissions as well. There's also this thing called branch office direct printing. Okay, so what is branch office direct printing? Branch office direct printing enables client computers to print directly to network printers that are shared on the network server. Okay, so basically if I'm in a branch office and this print server is in the main office, we might be like, this might be the Adelaide City, this might be Noarlunga. Or this could be in so this is a totally different branch office. So basically we still can have the main office server controlling access to this printer. So we actually send a print request to the main server, the server actually sends it back, and then the print job is sent to the computer. Deploying printers to clients. So basically you can deploy printers to clients by using group policy preferences. And when you do the 4AWS subject, we'll learn all about group policies and how to deploy printers. So it's fairly easy. Once you share a printer, you just have to connect to that printer, and based on your permissions, you have a level of access. And obviously you can manually install. There's also web printing, but this requires IIS, Internet Information Services, which is effectively Microsoft Server's web server. This allows users to print using a web page to connect to the print server. It also allows us to manage the printer using a web page. So this is enabled by adding the internet printing role service to the print and document service role. After installing the internet printing role service, you can view the web-based interface for accessing and managing the printer by putting in the server name. So if our server name was server1/printers, and we'll get to see a web page like that. So first of all, we see what printers are available and the status. If we click on one of the printers, we can actually see what jobs are in there. Okay. So basically, we can actually just do what we normally do by moving the jobs, managing the print jobs, moving up and down, deleting it, pausing it, restarting it, so forth. But we're doing this through a web page. And the thing about doing something through a web interface is that you can do it from any device, whether that be your PC, your phone, your tablet, pretty anything that can view a web page. And the other thing is, if you set everything, all your infrastructure correctly, I could do this from anywhere. Okay, like if I was on the road, like in Bali, I'm on holidays, but there's a big situation back in the office, they might call me on my mobile, and I just use my mobile. I've got my international roaming, data roaming. I connect back to my office using VPN or directly, and then I can use my mobile phone browser, go to this page, and still do the same things. Okay.
So basically, just makes you able to see the printers on.
Yeah, using a web interface, basically. Do the same things you would normally do through your little icon, the printer icon on your computer, but instead of doing that, you're doing it through a web page. Okay, which means anywhere, any platform, any operating system. Okay, so you could do this from a Linux machine, couldn't you? Or Apple iPhone. Okay, so that's the end of the theory part of this subject, this topic. What I want you to do is work on your worksheet 4, which walks you through basically a activity where you're creating users, sharing resources. And so that's what I want you guys to work on, guys. And obviously, if you have problems, what I want you to do is contact me and